Today's lecture will be on facilities, animal shelter housing, and the housing environment. My name is Denae Wagner. I work with the UC Davis CRET Shelter Medicine Program. I have a special interest in population health and preventive medicine. Prior to coming into shelter medicine, I was a dairy veterinarian. So the role of housing animals and the housing environment plays a key role in our production animals, but we're going to look at shelter housing and housing environment for animals in shelters and look at the role it plays there as well. So I want to talk a little bit about the 5 freedoms. Most of you are aware of the 5 freedoms for animal welfare. This is the basis for the guidelines for the standards of care in animal shelters. And the role that housing and the housing environment plays in providing or ensuring these freedoms is pretty significant. So we look at the freedom from hunger and thirst by ready access to fresh water and a diet to maintain full health and vigor. Freedom from discomfort by providing an appropriate environment, including shelter and a comfortable resting area. Freedom from pain, injury, or disease by prevention or rapid diagnosis and treatment. Freedom to express normal behavior by providing sufficient space, proper facilities, and company of the animal's own kind. And freedom from fear and distress by ensuring conditions and treatments which avoid mental suffering. So the role of housing in providing these freedoms is significant. We see impact on the individual animals because they're housed in the shelter environment pretty much 24/7 during their shelter stay. And we're going to see effects of stress, disease, and disease transmission due to housing and the housing environment. But we're also going to see effects on staff with housing, so efficiency of care depending on the housing type. Disease transmission, again, has a lot to do with the way we house animals and the housing type, and the stress that these staff members are going to experience due to the way animals are housed. We're also going to see effects on volunteers and publics, individuals, by the way animals are housed and how these people perceive the well-being of animals in their shelter environment. Also extremely important. So I'm going to be discussing housing and the housing environment today, but I want to also talk a little bit about what I'm not going to discuss in this lecture today, and that is other things that we can do to enrich animals' lives while they're in the shelter environment. I'm primarily going to talk about the physical structure of the housing units that we're using for animals, as well as the environment. And the other thing, there are many other things we can do to enrich animal lives in the shelter environment, but again, I'm going to stick with mostly the physical components of sheltering. So for housing environment, I'm going to talk about temperature, ventilation, humidity, and actually those 3 things really are integral together. And then I'll talk about noise and a little bit about lighting. I want to touch on or discuss housing and disease because there's a huge component of disease prevention in the type of housing that we use for animals in shelter environments. And then I'm going to talk about the primary enclosure, so where we're housing animals in the shelter, kind of our goals for housing size and setup. And then I'll wrap things up with a clinical case or with a common shelter housing problem. I'm going to start off with temperature. The AVMA recommends 60 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit for the temperature in a shelter environment where we're housing animals. This is a broad range, and certainly not every individual is going to be comfortable in that range. We'll see differences in breed, age, body condition score, hair coat, facial conformation, and one of the more common problems we see are animals that experience chill or coolness. We see this often with the animals housed in kennel environments where there might be cold floors. Um, and one way we can help these individuals is to meet their needs is to provide them with bed and bedding that's going to allow them to regulate their temperature of their environment. So beds that have higher walls can help reduce any draftiness that might be occurring. And then more bedding, additional bedding, so that they can kind of snuggle in will allow them to make some adjustment to their temperature. Ventilation is another big area of the environment in shelters. The object is to maintain a healthy air environment. It's often the recommendation falls into this description of 10 to 20 air exchanges per hour. But there are other considerations to think about when we're talking about ventilation, and this makes ventilation a challenging area. Animal density has a huge impact on ventilation and the ability to ventilate an area. And when animal density gets high or beyond what the ventilation is set for in a room or area, the air quality can greatly decrease. Ventilation is usually very hard to adjust. It's usually set at one rate and then and that's what it is. But animal density we can have some control over. So if we're housing animals in an area where the ventilation doesn't seem to be adequate, reducing animal density numbers can really help air quality in those areas that are not perhaps not being ventilated well with the current system. Ventilation requires delivery and removal of air, and most rooms will have vents, inlet and outlet type vents that allow ventilation to occur. And one problem that we sometimes run into is that these vents are obstructed either with cages or furniture and different things like that. So ensuring that those vents are not obstructed can help ensure better ventilation. Odor is a problem or an issue in many shelter animal housing areas, and sometimes, again, if ventilation is not adequate, we'll get more odor in the area, and sometimes simply more frequent removal of organic waste can help decrease odor issues. So picking up feces or emptying litter boxes more frequently than once or twice a day can help reduce odors in areas where ventilation doesn't seem to be quite adequate. Moisture is another issue, and we depend on ventilation to remove moisture out of the air. This is more commonly a problem in dog housing areas, but anything that we can do to remove moisture especially after cleaning, when we're using hose and water to clean up after animals, things like squeegeeing the floors to remove as much moisture as possible can reduce the load on ventilation and help provide dry environments, which is really important for the animals. We also see species differences in needs for ventilation. We talk about disease transmission, aerosolization of organisms, and disease transmission through the air. And this is primarily a problem in dog housing areas where we do get aerosolization of organisms and disease transmission, primarily talking about kennel cough. But this is not particularly a cat problem. We don't see aerosolization of disease, particularly upper respiratory disease. So when we talk about ventilation with cats, we're not talking about, we do want high quality, good quality air, but we're not talking about reducing disease transmission through ventilation in the cat housing areas. Cleaning, I touched on this with moisture, but cleaning differences between different animal housing areas. Some we have a high moisture and we really depend on ventilation to help remove some of that moisture. Cat housing areas are often low moisture, so we don't have some of the stressors on ventilation to remove moisture in those areas. With cats, we do see some species differences with between dogs as far as particulate matter in the air, and litter type that's being used can have an effect on, or can have a great effect on ventilation or the ability of the room to be well ventilated. Clay litters tend to be dusty and put more particulate into the air. And if that's a problem, there are some biodegradable litter materials that are available. These are plant materials, wood, paper that are less dusty. And in rooms that have less, perhaps, than adequate ventilation, switching to a less dusty litter might be helpful for improving air quality. Humidity is the last of the three temperature, ventilation, and humidity all kind of work interactively. We have recommendations for humidity, relative humidity levels in 30 to 70% in animal housing areas. Humidity above 70% is high, and it's a much wetter environment, promotes bacterial and fungal growth, and can be corrosive to many building materials. And high humidity reduces animal welfare. It's uncomfortable to be housed in high humid sort of environments, and we see increases in respiratory disease. Housing environments that are low humidity are very dry, and these tend to be dusty. We get a lot of particulates in the air, and these can cause respiratory irritation. So again, we sort of aim for this 30 to 70% humidity. Noise. Noise levels impact well-being, both for the animals and for the people that work with the animals. And it's a stressor. In acute cases, we see stress. In chronic, we'll see stress as well, but we can also have hearing loss and damage. Dogs and cats' hearing is more sensitive than human hearing, with cats probably being the most sensitive. The OSHA has thresholds for noise levels for the working environment for human beings, and that threshold is met at around 85 decibels as far as needing or recommending the use of hearing protection. And because our animals are more sensitive in their hearing, it seems logical that this threshold is also probably a pretty good one as far as being careful about having a living environment where the noise levels exceed this sort of 85 decibel level. We know in the dog housing areas we frequently exceed 85 decibels. A barking dog can easily exceed 100 decibels. I've recorded dog kennels at 115 decibels with even a single dog barking. It's important to acknowledge that cleaning time in the shelter is probably the noisiest time of day and can be a very stressful time for animals housed in shelters. And then for cats, we see some problems with noise, particularly dog noise, adversely impacting their well-being when they're housed in areas that they can hear dogs. There's quite a bit of things we can do, though, to reduce noise or the movement of noise through animal shelters. One of the important things to do is to separate species as much as possible. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. But we can also, there's things we can do in the shelter to reduce noise. By keeping room doors closed to contain noise in areas that are noisy and to limit noise entrance in areas that are quiet, especially cat housing areas, keeping room doors closed really decreases the amount of noise that enters into those areas. If staff understands the need for quietness in the housing areas, there's quite a bit we can do when we open and close caging units to keep them quiet with just a little bit of thought on what we're doing. I recorded over 10 decibel level decrease in noise level just by opening and closing cage doors, trying to do it quietly. Even the collection of metal bowls and there's a lot of metal on metal in our housing and in the bowls that we use to feed and water animals, and just being aware that there can be noise occur from collecting those things and opening and closing those things, and they can be done in a quieter manner, can be really helpful. I touched on the cleaning process and how noisy it is, and if we can impact the amount of noise that animals experience by being efficient in the cleaning process. I visited lots of shelters where staff are multitasking during the cleaning process, so they'll clean some, they'll run off and do something else and then come back to do more cleaning, and really extend the cleaning process out through hours of the day. And this just extends the amount of time that animals are experiencing noise, so being efficient in the cleaning process can be really helpful to decrease the amount of noise that the animals experience throughout the day. We are seeing improvements in manufacturing of cage and kennel materials. Some of this helps to reduce animal noise. Some of the latches and hinges and doors, I'll talk about that. And then there's always a lot of discussion about limiting visual contact, especially between dogs, and whether this increases barking noise in kennels or not. And most of the recommendations right now are to limit visual ability between dogs across from each other in the housing environment. But Wells did a study in 1998 looking at visual contact between dogs and did not see an increase in barking. And dogs that had visual contact actually resulted in improved welfare for those individuals. So the word is still out on visual contact, but there is some indication that actually having dogs the ability to see other dogs improves their welfare. And Wells also did a study in 2002 looking at the effects of music on animal well-being, and saw a calming effect with classical music. I just want to touch on the separation of species, because in the busyness of running an animal shelter, sometimes we house our species together. In this picture on the left is a cat in the upper part of the picture in the cat housing part of the facility. And in the lower part of that picture, you can see a small chihuahua who is rapidly barking while being housed in that area. The graph on the right is actually a recording of this time period. There was actually 2 chihuahuas housed in the cat housing area. And this graph depicts about 8 days of shelter, of noise levels in the cat housing area. There's, I don't know if you can see it. I'm going to try to use my little arrow here. But this is one day, this is another day, and this is a third day. And during those 3 days, the dogs were housed in the cat housing area. And you can see this is 80 decibels. So this is a graph measured by a dosimeter. This is 80 decibels. This is 30 decibels. And for a great majority of the day during these 3 days, the noise levels were above 80 decibels and quite high, sometimes even reaching over 100 decibels from these two small dogs housed in the cat housing area. On this day, this is a Saturday, the dogs were removed from the cat housing area at about noon, which is around here. And after that period, the noise level within the shelter was much quieter without these long periods of over 80 decibels occurring. We still see some little peaks in these days of high noise levels, and those correspond with cleaning time. So we do see an impact of noise with cleaning time, but when we separate species, we see a lot less noise occurring in the cat facility at that time. So it's really important to separate species. These are some of the manufacturing and design improvements that we have seen. This is sound dampening material, this picture on the left with the arrow pointing to it. That's about a 4-inch by 6-inch strip of sound dampening material. And these are usually, this material can be purchased automotive or automobile sound dampening material. It tends to be sticky on one side and reflective on the other, and that sticky side can be adhered to stainless steel housing units. A lot of our older housing units don't have this on. A lot of the newer stuff, the manufacturers are putting this on, but the older ones aren't. But it can be done quite easily just by purchasing this material. And it really decreases the resonance from a very high pitch to kind of a dull thud, which although loud is much better at the low thud than the high-pitched resonance. The picture on the right is a high-density plastic latch, and this improves or reduces noise by decreasing the amount of metal-on-metal noise that occurs with just opening and closing of cages. We've used these latches in the housing that we have at our local shelter for over 2 years, and these have been very durable. I'll talk a little bit about light. Lighting is important as we care for animals. We want to be able to see them. We also want the public to be able to see them when they come in to adopt. Light and dark periods should support circadian rhythms, so natural lighting is going to do that naturally, but if our animal housing units are in areas where we don't have natural lighting, then we're going to have to do that artificially. And a 12-hour light and a 12-hour dark period will support circadian rhythms. And having it be routine is good. Animals are able to adjust when routines are established in the shelter, and lighting is no different than any other thing we do. So having that be routine for them is helpful. Again, natural light is what we prefer, and there's more and more research coming out that indicates natural light and views of nature beneficial to well-being and health. And a lot of this is coming out in human literature, but the expectation would be that this is the same for animals as well. And this is just a picture of a kennel that is poorly lit on the left, and on the right is a more well-lit kennel, and we're able to observe the animal much better in that type of lighting environment. I want to talk a little bit about why disease occurs, because housing and the housing environment play such a big role. These 3 circles represent the host or the animal on the left circle. The pathogens that are going to be responsible for disease are on the circle on the right. And the lower circle is housing and the housing environment. And this is the disease triad, so these three things together um, affect whether we see disease occur or not. And the more they are out of balance, the more they overlap, and the greater risk there is for disease. And the more that they're in balance, the more that the immune system is working properly for the host, that their nutrition status is good, that they're doing well physically, the more that the cleaning is appropriate in the shelter environment, the less pathogen load that we have, the more that housing meets animals' needs and the environment is comfortable for the animal, the less overlap we see and less risk for disease. So there's some key components to housing that have been developed that reduce disease in animal shelters. And one of these is individual housing. The reason that we individually house animals is to reduce the risk of disease for the population. We want the individual housing to meet the animal's needs, and part of that can be accomplished with double compartment housing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that is a really key component to housing animals in shelters. Another component, and this has more to do with the pathogen and decreasing pathogen load in the population, is the ability to isolate or remove animals from the general population when they are sick with infectious disease. So having an area for isolation is very important to reducing disease in the population. Along with that, we want effective cleaning and disinfection between housing animals. And we want to be able to provide that low stress environment to keep that circle on the bottom from getting out of balance. We want a low stress environment to support animal health. And lastly, we really, if at all possible, we want to limit animal handling during the times that we're taking care of the entire population. When we're taking care of every animal in the population, we have a high risk for transmission of disease or organisms that are going to cause disease. And a lot of that risk comes through staff handling of animals in order to care for them. Individual housing of animals really comes in two types. The housing types that we have are either single compartment, where these tend to be smaller housing units, and when we house animals in a single compartment, the animal needs to be removed from that housing unit for cleaning and daily care, especially when we're talking about dogs housed in a single compartment kennel, because for cleaning to occur, that animal needs to be removed from that housing unit and placed somewhere else, which is going to take a staff member is going to need to handle them. For cats, single compartment housing units tend to be very small, and oftentimes cats do need to be removed from the unit for cleaning, although sometimes we can spot clean with them in there. But again, those units tend to be quite small. Double compartment housing units are the other type of housing we have for animals. And traditionally we think of the double-sided dog kennels with a guillotine door in between. These allow the animal to be restricted to one side or the other to enable cleaning and feeding without having to handle that animal. So the animal doesn't need to leave its housing unit, and we can really reduce the risk of disease transmission with this type of housing unit. These housing units are also, generally speaking, larger than the single compartment housing units. And not only do they reduce disease transmission because the animal doesn't have to leave the housing unit for care, but they also meet the animal's need for separation, for being housed in an area or a housing unit that has separation of the feeding and resting area from an area where they will eliminate. And I'll speak a little bit more on that specifically later, but that is an important component. to the double compartment housing. Here's a couple pictures of the single compartment housing. On the left is a cat in this would be a pretty traditional 2x2 cage. That's a stainless steel cage there. And on the right is a single compartment dog kennel. These are some examples of double compartment housing. This is a little bit newer concept for cat housing. The picture on the left is a cat in a double compartment stainless steel cage. You can see the main compartment is a little bit bigger than the compartment where the tail end of the cat is still in. That is where the litter box is. But the main compartment is bigger in that particular type of double compartment housing unit. The picture on the right is also a double compartment housing unit. You can see the pass-through in the front, and there's a black circular door that can close that pass-through to restrict the cat to one side or the other for cleaning and care purposes. The pass-through, of course, in the upper left picture is being used by the cat at the moment, but that can be closed to restrict the cat to one side or the other in that unit as well. Most everyone's familiar with a double compartment housing for dogs. That's pretty much a traditional dog kennel with a guillotine door. One thing I want to mention about the guillotine door, in both of these pictures the guillotine door does not encompass the entire width of the kennel, and this is important as we think about meeting animal needs and having a place to retreat. When the door is partial, and especially the offset guillotine doors where there is a portion of the wall remaining, the dog can use that to retreat from one side or the other to get around the side of that wall if there's something occurring on the inside of the kennel or the housing environment that the dog wants to get away from. They can go around that portion of the wall and kind of basically retreat to the other side to get away from something that might be occurring that they don't want to be near. And finally, just to stress the need for double compartment housing for animals, this is a picture of 6-week-old pups. This is a picture I took in a Vancouver Island shelter in British Columbia, Canada. So older shelter facility. This litter of pups was housed in a double compartment housing unit. You can see the bed and the food and water dishes are in the front. This is pretty early in the morning, so the kennel hasn't been cleaned up yet, but you can see all the piles of poop that are in the back part of that kennel. And these 6-week-old puppies haven't been trained to do that. This is just something that they desire to do, and when given the opportunity, have done so on their own. You'll notice in the front of the kennel, the bed, and around the area where they're in, there is no organic material in that area. It's all concentrated in the second compartment, the back compartment of that kennel. So I'm going to talk about the primary enclosure now and kind of the goals that we want to provide for the basic needs of animals in housing, how we want to house them to meet their needs and keep them happy and healthy. I'll talk a little bit about adequate sizing of a housing unit, but size of a housing unit is very dependent on the length of stay we're expecting for an animal to stay in that housing unit. And for the most part, I'm going to talk about our animal sheltering with fairly short lengths of stay, 1 week to 2 weeks. 1 week to 2 weeks length of stay as being kind of what we're aiming for. We're not looking to keep these animals for long periods of time in the shelter environment. And what we want in housing animals for that period of time, we want them to be able to ambulate normally, perform normal postures, stand, sit, sit, stretch, lie comfortably with their limbs extended. Just be comfortable in the housing environment we provide. We want them to have food and water. And ideally, we would like them to have food and water in a manner that maintains the availability and prevents contamination. So things that we can provide food and water in that are not tippable or unlikely to tip or move around and get contaminated. All animals should be provided a bed, and all animals should be provided a place for retreat or hiding. We should provide animals with a elimination area that is separate from their resting and eating area, and this is a need for both dogs and cats. Double compartment housing really meets that need. And finally, our primary enclosure should allow us to care for animals in the shelter environment without having to remove them from their housing unit. Not only is that important for reducing disease and disease transmission, as I've already mentioned, but this is really a need of the animals, and it reduces their stress, especially as they're newly arrived to the shelter environment, and those animals that are not socialized. Handling animals can be very stressful, especially new people, new staff, or when the animal has arrived new at a shelter, everyone's new to them, and being handled by people that they're not familiar with can be very stressful. I touched on disease transmission earlier, but this ability to care for animals without having to handle them is also a staff safety issue. So this size that we're talking about for cats, right now the size recommendation is for 11 square feet of space or greater in floor space. And for those housing units that have shelves, this floor space does not include the space that is on the shelf. This picture that I have included is a recent remodel that we did. We put the portal through from side to side on these cages, making this 4-unit housing unit into a 2-unit housing unit. So these individual units are 30 inches wide by 28 deep by about 28 high, and connecting them together then makes a double-sided housing unit that has about 13 square feet of floor space, and really makes for a nice short-term housing unit for cats in an animal shelter. For dogs, the size of the housing unit, the needs of the animal are going to be variable because we see such variability in size of dogs. It's hard to come up with kind of a standard size. Many shelters have made their dog housing kennels fit a variety of sizes, so they tend to be bigger, and really that meets the majority of the needs of most dogs that are housed in those units. Kind of some common sizes we see for dog kennels are between 3 and 5 foot wide type kennels. We may see the double-sided kennel where there's equal dimension on the front side and on the back side, 6 foot, 8 foot on those, for a total length from 12 to 16 feet. We are seeing some kennels being where one side is larger than the other, and that is okay too, as long as they aren't very small, as long as they allow adequate room for the dog that's housed in that type of unit. We prefer indoor-outdoor housing. Having access to the outdoors is important for the environment that they're in. Lighting, you get natural lighting, and the air quality is generally excellent outside. Occasionally we see indoor housing kennels, and that's okay too. We have a lot more dependency on mechanical ventilation and temperature control for providing that type of housing, but that can be done well as well. We may see some smaller housing units specifically for small dogs. Of course, those aren't going to work for larger dogs, but having separate small dog housing areas are sometimes beneficial. And then I just wanted to mention having larger housing units for dogs for special needs, mothers with pups, or for giant breeds is beneficial too. I just want to touch on what we generally expect to see inside a primary enclosure for cats. If the structure is large enough, if we have a 11-foot square space for a cat, we can put a hiding structure inside. The picture on the upper left is a cat feral box, which works very nicely for a hiding structure that can be put inside. Hide, perch, and goes are another disposable type hiding structure that can be used for cats. Paper bags, cardboard boxes, really anything that the cat can get inside can work as a place for hiding or retreat. Litter boxes need to be provided for cats inside their housing units. I've visited shelters that did not provide litter boxes, and that's not acceptable. Cats need a litter box with some type of litter substrate. The picture on the upper right is a cat using a stretch and scratch scratching structure. These are kind of neat. They can be put inside the cage and allow the cats to express some natural behavior of scratching. Picture on the lower right is a cat using a shelf. This is in a stainless steel cage. The bottom middle picture is a bed. All cats need a bed. This cat is curled up inside its bed. The housing unit is an indoor-outdoor type of run, basically, for the cat. So that it's in the picture is the indoor side of it, and you can see the cat door, which leads to the outdoor part of this cat housing area. And the final picture is a cat on its bed on a shelf in a double-sided stainless steel housing unit. So meeting the needs are fairly basic. This is another way we can provide cats with choice in their housing units, and this is a partial cage cover. These are becoming more popular. They allow cats more choice in the environment. They can either be in the area where they can look out, or they can go behind that cover and have some visual protection from their environment. As far as a primary enclosure for dogs, it's fairly basic. We want to provide them with, when we can, a double compartment unit. The picture in the middle is a double compartment kennel. The guillotine door is closed on that. The remainder of the pictures are single compartment units, but there are some of the bedding and places of retreat are pictured in there that we can provide for dogs. The high-sided beds, as I discussed earlier, can help dogs regulate temperature. They also can provide them with a little place for retreat if they want to just kind of hunker down inside there, as can the dog carrier type structures. There's a corunda beds over in the lower right picture. Those are fairly popular. We like to see bedding on top of those corunda beds in addition to just the bed. They can be a little bit chilly. And there's a lot of the plastic beds are you can see in many of these pictures. And of course food and water is also necessary within the housing structures. I forgot to mention that for the cats, but that that is needed in the cat housing primary enclosure as well. I'll just touch on group housing for cats. we recommend that only adult healthy cats be housed in group housing areas. They should have at minimum 18 square foot of floor space, and again, any elevated space should not be included in this calculation. Cats use space to deal with stressful situations, so and stress can occur with socialization with other cats, and so providing at least 18 square feet of floor space is recommended when we group house cats. And we recommend, or we don't recommend, intake housing be that of group housing due to the high risk for disease transmission on newly arrived cats. We do see some benefit from housing dogs together, bonded pairs. Dogs that have come to the shelter that are bonded pairs can sometimes be housed together, but we continue to recommend that they have access to individual housing for feeding time and for nighttime or any other time where observation is limited. And I want to wrap up the lecture today with talking about a common shelter housing problem. Poor cat housing is one of the greatest shortcomings observed in shelters and has a substantially negative impact on both health and well-being. This is a quote from the Guidelines for Standards of Care in Animal Shelters. So the clinical case I'm going to present is actually one of a shelter, our local shelter. This is a municipal shelter with an annual intake of about 2,500 cats. We have fairly traditional housing. This shelter was built in the 1960s, and I'm sure that the housing units we have in our cat facility are those same housing units from that time. So these are about 50 years old. They're 2x2 stainless steel cages. And just another mention, these housing units, cats weren't intended to be housed in these long term. They were really very short-term housing units. But animal sheltering has changed, and we now house cats for longer periods of times in the shelter. So these small housing units, these are about 24 inches wide. There's a typo in here. They should be 28 inches deep and about 24 inches high. But the floor space is around 4.5 square feet. So pretty small housing units. And observing these animals in these housing units, really it becomes apparent that this housing unit is too small to meet the animal's needs for what is likely going to be probably a 5 to 10 day stay in the holding area. You can see that there's really little to no room to assume normal postures of laying down and walking or moving about at all. And the shelter is trying to do the best they can with this size housing unit, putting a hiding place in these cat housing units, but those solid structures take up a lot of room, a lot of floor space. And in some of our more recent research, we found that these small cat housing units, these 2x2 size cages with a solid structure in them, actually increase the risk for upper respiratory disease when there's a solid hiding structure in there. And I'll talk a little bit more about what we did to change that. So we wanted to come up with a plan, strategies for improving the cat housing. And there were some things that we can do immediately. And one was to really concentrate on doing good population management, tighter management to prevent inadvertent kind of long lengths of stay, animals that stayed there longer than was good for their health and well-being because of the small cage size. We also there's some things we could do to really maximize the floor space in those housing units. And then we have an intermediate plan to modify that housing, convert single units to double-sided units. And then long-term is the hope for a new facility and new housing. So maximizing floor space really means trying to provide as much of that floor space for the animal to use as possible. If we remove the hiding structure, we open up floor space, and the picture on the right is an elevated bed. Those can be made or purchased. Caranda Beds makes them, but they're fairly easy to make on their own. And placing an elevated bed in there, you can drape a towel over that and still provide a hiding place for the individual animal, but you can see there's quite a bit more floor space opened up. And additionally, if we were to get the food and water dishes attached to the front of the cage, we would also open up a little more space that way. So draping the towel can provide a hiding space, but also the partial cage covers is another way to provide hiding space for a cat housed inside that cage with a bed just placed on the floor. The instructions for making the elevated cat bed can be found at sheltermedicine.com. Here's an example of the food and water dishes that can be attached to the front of the cage or kennel, and again, helping to maximize the floor space, get those up off the floor. The intermediate step that we took was to modify existing housing. You can see back behind this cat there's a portal through the cage wall going to the next cage. So modifying the cages from single to double-sided takes a little bit of work, but it's very doable, and it's an option for shelters that perhaps do not have the resources for purchase of new housing, and this cage modification can be done in the meantime. So holes are cut in the walls of the stainless steel cage. This could be done with other cage types as well, but stainless steel probably the most challenging to get through that material, but there are many different ways to do that. One of them is with a plasma cutter. That makes that pretty easy to do. But I just heard from a group that used a grinder to start the hole and a tin stip to finish up cutting the holes to put their portals through their cages to improve their cat housing. So that was pretty impressive. In this case, we used PVC portals to place in the hole that we made, and attached a single hinged door for time of cleaning. Otherwise, the pass-throughs are left open for the cat to have access to both sides of the cage. And so this is the current housing in this shelter, and it's a little bit dark, but you can see the portals in the 3 cages from top to bottom on the far left-hand side. You can also see the use of the partial cage covers. You can also see a towel draped to also provide some hiding area for a cat housed in that area. And long-term goals for cat housing would be a new facility for our local shelter and new cat housing. These are just some examples. One that I showed earlier, which was the double-sided housing unit. It's a walk-in cat housing area. That's the picture on the right, the kind of green walled, decorated, nicely decorated cat housing structure, which has a similarly sized outdoor portion or porch. And then the smaller picture on the left is what I typically call kind of the shower stall size cat housing. And that's also, you can walk into that. And those tend to use the shelves for elevated space in those units. And those can be very nice housing units for cats as well. So I just want to wrap this lecture up with when we address and meet animals' needs for housing and housing environment, we provide a solid foundation for health and well-being, not only for the individual, but for the shelter's entire animal population. And hopefully I've given you a few tips and clues of things you can do with housing environments that you may have now, and also some information about ways to house animals in new facilities. Thank you, and that wraps it up for today.